It was my first day at Clifton Rehabilitation Centre, the place in which I'd received the treatment for a shattered personality, the place where they began the tedious process of untangling my amnesic mind, a place where I had to begin to consciously recall what I was trying desperately to forget. The program there was appealing and useful to me, since the clinicians believed they could recover the episodes which they referred to as personalities from deep within my memory compartments. They explained that they could provide assistance in unscrambling my mind and could help me begin to separate reality from fantasy. First days are always a drag, aren't they? I walked along the corridor and read the poem chalked on his wall. Lo, Jesus meets us, risen from the tomb. Lovingly he greets us, scatters fear and gloom. Let the church with gladness hymns of triumph sing, for his Lord now liveth, death has lost its sting. Thine be the glory. Edmund Bewdrey, 1854 to 1932. And there was a sign on his door, Paracentesis, the surgical puncture of a body cavity in order to draw off excess fluid. It was my neighbour's place, the lifer. As I was walking past his room, he called me in. "Oh, do come in. Sol, isn't it?" "Yes," I said, offering my hand this time. "Sol Liddon, Chelsea." "Oh, yes, that's where they have the flower show." "That's right," I said. "Every year." With his hair like a nest of vipers, and a pair of dark brown eyes checking me out from behind black-framed brows the size of motorhome windscreens, I felt intimidated straight away. Through bloodshot veins, he looked at me as though he'd missed every night of sleep that week, told me that for most of his stay at the Clifton Centre, he'd fought a battle against insomnia. Apparently, it was the sun that kept him awake. He knew its exact position, even in the dead of night. At best, he said he'd been reduced to fatigue and struggled to cope. At worst, he claimed he'd lose control. When I found out more about him, I thought it hardly surprising that he had a bit of trouble sleeping. As I looked around his room, I noticed at least a dozen glass jars that had been meticulously stacked on the 3 shelves above his television. That's an impressive collection. Somebody likes flowers. It's true what they say, then. "What's that?" he asked, peering at me over the top of his glasses. "Honey doesn't go off." He seemed to come alive with that question. He skipped over to the shelves, collected one of the jars, pushed his glasses back up the bridge of his nose, and beckoned me to the sun-drenched window. "Whereabouts in Chelsea?" he asked, whilst inspecting me so closely I could see myself in his glasses. "Whereabouts in Chelsea what?" I asked. "Whereabouts do you live? Which street?" Oh, sorry. I was too busy looking at your jars." "A little terrace, just off the King's Road, near the bottom, closer to World's End, actually." Bermondsey for me, for the first 5 years. We lived in a tin house, post-war, a bee factory. My brother Baz used to keep them. The backyard was like a slum. We started out sleeping on newspaper in the shed. We had to go through rubbish bins to find quilts and covers. Chelsea, he said. Very nice. Next time you're heading home, do me a favour, he said. What's that? I asked. Look out for the bees, he said. I will, I said. I'm sorry, what do you mean? What I mean is, it's been another hard winter for them. They'll be coming out of their hives now. So few flowers to forage these days, they'll soon be on the verge of collapse. I've applied for a temporary license, so hopefully next week, if the treatment goes well, they might let me go home. What did you want me to do exactly? I asked him, without having the faintest clue what he was talking about. Dandelion flowers are bursting with pollen. Their nectar could be the very cornerstone of survival to them this time of year. So how can I help? I asked. Simple, he said firmly. I want you to tell everyone you meet to delay mowing their lawn for at least a month until the other flowers have emerged. Right, I said. I'll do that. And one other thing, he said. What's that? In the woods, the purple bell leaves will soon be long and glossy, and they'll begin to whisper their crispy glitter as the breeze brushes them around. They sound beautiful, I said. They are Orchis muscula, or early purples with purplish crimson petals that are marked with purple spots. You can't miss them. Do you think you could find me some and bring them back with you? I'll try to do that, I said. Don't get yourself stung, though, he said quietly to himself as he walked towards the window. Gordon's bees were big and black. Their buzz was low and gorged on the farm diesel they were feeding on. Their eyes glowed a steady red as they roamed around Gordon's room. They kept their honey, not in combs of wax as yellow as altar candles, but in a cardboard hive made from breakfast cereal boxes that stood on his windowsill. Suddenly, a bee came in through the window and buzzed around him. Whilst I was taking steps backwards, he walked into the bee's space and appeared to be trying to make eye contact with it. He didn't wear a veil. He didn't seem afraid of them getting too close. To me, it seemed as though the bee was already circling inside his mind. With the insect buzzing lazily around him, he gently swayed about, shifting his tonnage from one foot to another. When the bee eventually landed, he collected it under a jar, tapped it out onto his hand, and began the precarious task of inspecting its legs, gently turning it over on his fingers, counting each of the chitinous rods that formed the framework of its wings, before letting it go again. This one's been flying through the air con again. Throws the mixture out, he said. Mixture, I said. Do bees run on a mixture? Oh, this one does. When he flies too close to the fans, it gives him the bends. The bends, I said. Don't divers get the bends? They do if they come up too fast. With bees, it's the turning of the blades. It affects the technology, he said, carefully scrutinizing the head of the bee as it floated around in the space at the end of his nose. Every time it happens, he starts heading off at right angles. He starts to deviate from the correct pathway. We can't allow any deviations, can we, Sol? Almost as a protest, the bee landed on his nose and crawled around in a a slow figure of 8. Gordon didn't move a muscle. Obviously, there are other problems that can prevent them coming home. Natural fluctuations in the magnetic fields, solar flares, explosions of the sun, that type of thing. The tiniest of things can disrupt their homing ability. After a while, the bee took off again. It hovered around his finger, and they appeared to lock eyes. What I mean is, in the space between their two realities, I'm sure that something happened. I fancied that I heard, very briefly, the big plastic clock on the wall pause in its interminable task of knocking time into manageable bits, and in that moment I would swear that there was a connection between that man and the insect. Gordon waved an arm, and the bee flew back off towards the hive. He followed the path of sun across the room, and wrenching a chair to a table, caged by dusty bars of light, he sat down and focused a loving gaze on the hive. He sighed. "Do you know anything about bees, Sol?" I didn't really. I had to admit that to him. So quietly and calmly, he gave me the rundown. Bees are almost the oldest creatures in the universe. They've been making honey in the same way since dinosaurs walked the planet. No mortal men could begin to understand their habits and modes of thought. Pretty tenacious, I said. Oh, there's nowhere they won't go for flowers, no matter how distant and dangerous. Gordon stared through the broad bars of sunlight and out through the window. In fact, the more obscure the place, he said, the more likely they are to go. The warm hum of the bees had achieved what innumerable psychologists, lawmen, and the Crown prosecution had been trying to do for years. But as he spoke, spears of sun seemed to pin him down. When he spotted another larger bee, he became fixated. When it settled, it stung him. I could feel the heat under my collar. I could see the dark barb pulsing in his finger. And when he raised his hand to his mouth and began to suck, it sapped the spirit out of me. He didn't batter an eyelid. He got up, walked to the window, spat through the bars, and carried on, totally unmoved. "Well, Sol, let me explain," he said, scrutinizing the handwritten label on the jar. "The Egyptians used to keep domestic bees. Sealed pots of honey were found in most of the graves of the ancient pharaohs. Did you know that, Sol?" Before I could answer, he'd unscrewed the lid of the jar and was tinkling a small pocket knife around the inside of the glass. It's almost unbelievable, isn't it, how a simple little syrup could still be edible after 5,000 years. Whilst I remained glued to the dark, sickly gloop that turned over itself inside the jar, he went on talking about his blessed bees, stopping from time to take licks from the knife edge. He wound up the strand of honey that ran from it, placed it on a paper napkin on the windowsill, removed a book from the shelf, and began leafing through the pages with his eyes full of activity and his twitchy fingers hovering over the pages until eventually he settled on the most relevant patch of information. "Ah, here we are, page 457, as an astringent for wounds. Just as I thought. There are several factors that can extend honey's use-by date to millennia. It's 95% sugar, equally divided between glucose and fructose." "Well, we know that much," he said, turning the pages. After a few moments looking out of the window, he slammed the book closed and quickly recited the rest from memory. "Come closer, Sol. Look here. Closer," he said, pulling at my sleeve, his black, bug-like eyes carefully inspecting me. Sugars are hygroscopic, which means they contain very little water in their natural state, but they'll readily absorb moisture if left exposed to it. He collected the knife up and ran a finger along its edge before sucking on the finger longingly. "Absolutely delicious. Would you like to try?" he said, offering me the knife. "No, thanks. I'm fine, really." Once you get a taste for something, the urge is too strong. It's impossible to stop, don't you think? I just agreed. And he went on. You see, nectar is naturally high in moisture. He dipped the knife back into the jar, whipped it out, and whilst breathing in deeply, ran it under his nostrils, his face lightened golden by the glow from the window. That's what gives it its wonderful scent, and that's why even the faintest whiff of honey is worth more than none at all. It smells fantastic. So sweet, I said, breathing in the room, getting a little carried away by his enthusiasm. Before processing, the bees remove some of the moisture from the nectar by flapping their wings intensely. Each droplet is swallowed and regurgitated by the bees up to 50 times in order to dry it out further. He turned to me very quickly, and when he began to raise his voice, it shocked me. "Listen to me, Sol, this is very important." Once he had my attention, he lowered his voice again. "Honey has medicinal properties. It's the medicine of the future." "You mean that it can cure illnesses?" I asked. "Not only that," he said, taking a lick of the knife. "When slathered into a cut, it sucks out moisture." As he was talking, he began spreading a thin coating onto the back of his hand. "It prevents microbial colonization, while the hydrogen peroxide disinfects the area." "So you can actually dress a cut with honey?" "It's a biological miracle. I've treated wounds with it many times." "Look," he said, offering out his hands for me to inspect. "Not a scratch. I honestly believe honey will play a part in the resurrection." He was laughing when he said that. One of those laughs that runs itself out and leaves the owner looking at you in a strange way until you look at them and they look away. I looked at his hands, and it was true, they were baby soft. "For the honey to stay good, it must be in a sealed container," he said, carefully screwing the lid back onto the honey jar. "That way, it might last 100 lifetimes." He came right up to my face again. This time, I could feel the penknife pressed to my stomach and his warm breath against my cheek as he whispered, "Of course, we made them." "Made what?" I asked, with the tip of the knife firmly pressed into me. "Mechanical bees. Nobody believed us at first. Made them with human tastes." "What? Robot bees? That's insane." "Programmed to reproduce themselves from raw materials taken from their surroundings, their offspring, so perfect they carry the instructions needed to further clone themselves, and so the process continues indefinitely." He pressed the knife deeper until its point became a major issue. His voice went low, deep, and slightly twisted. "You see this honey? It's brown like treacle, thick as sin, and sweet like revenge." With an increased passion and a tightening grip, he began to shout, "The bee will die only once. His death gives strength to men. One man properly stung can live forever. For them, death will have no sting." I was being pulled towards the hive, and I panicked. I had to push him away hard. He slammed down on the chair and went into a kind of meltdown. Even more sophisticated, self-replicating machines, swarms of drones the size of pinheads, with the mind of a man, infiltrate buildings, their tiny eyes everywhere, little things that run the world. And so he went on, until his voice trailed off into something very simple. Shall I go to the toilet now? Or can I wait until after lunch? No, I'll go now. Once he had made up his mind, he jumped up as though I wasn't there, and off he went, slamming the metal door behind him with such haste that it caused an echoing boom and a flurry of notes, appointments, and photos to lift up off his wall. A nurse came into the room, picked up the knife, and pressed the alarm.